I'm going to be speaking on unsung heroes in 20th century Oak Ridge history. These heroes are science heroes. They're not superheroes. And you can see the list of names of people I'm going to be talking about. Unsung heroes are people not noticed or praised for their great achievements, and I'm going to talk about folks in relationship to Oak Ridge. We've all heard, of course, of Oppenheimer, but do we really know his direct impacts on Oak Ridge? And that's, I'll go into that. You all, of course, have heard of messenger RNA. It's the key ingredient of the Pfizer and the Moderna COVID shots that have given us immunity for at least a few months at a time. And it turns out that two ORHPA researchers, Ken Volkin and Lazarus Strachan, actually were the first to discover messenger RNA, except they gave it the unsexy name of DNA-like RNA. And they published some papers in the 50s, and a number of people learned about that. But the Nobel Prize actually went to a couple of French researchers in 1965 for the discovery of what they call messenger RNA. Now, former ORHPA director Alan Weinberg was very concerned about the fact that they weren't getting proper credit. So he wrote in a 2001 letter to the journal Nature that the original discovery of messenger RNA at ORHPA, quote, has never received the acclaim it deserves. He called it next to the original discovery of the molecular structure of DNA, probably the most important event in the history of molecular biology. He went on to say, Paul Berg, winner of the 1980 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, called the ORHPA research an unsung but momentous discovery of a fundamental mechanism in genetic chemistry and a seminal discovery that has never received its proper due. So I like his use of the word unsung. Another unsung scientific hero was Audrey Stevens. She was an ORHPA biologist, and when it was announced that she was elected in 1998 for the National Academy of Sciences, she had unfortunately lost her job because of funding cuts. But her job was quickly restored. Now, she independently demonstrated that RNA is synthesized in E. coli bacterial cells by an enzyme called RNA polymerase. And there were three other people who also independently discovered this. None of them won a Nobel Prize. But the man who created detailed molecular images of RNA won the 2006 Nobel Prize. And Audrey's son, Chris Niobe, she had two sons with Salil Niobe, an Oak Ridge High School graduate, was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. And he actually spoke to a formal audience last year. Now, we're going to talk about Alfred Neer. Have you all heard of Alfred Neer? Okay, now he invented the mass spectrometer at the University of Minnesota. The mass spectrograph had been invented in England a number of years before, but this was a fine American invention that worked very well. Now, he was friends with some really famous people that you all have heard of. Enrico Fermi, who was in charge of the reactor, demonstrated the chain reaction. And then he was also in charge from Chicago of the X-Can pilot reactor, which Weinberg helped design with his calculations. He knew Lawrence and he visited each other. And he was good friends with John Dunning, who helped pioneer the gaseous diffusion process using K25. Al Neer was the first to use this mass spectrometry to isolate uranium-235 from the other two uranium isotopes. He did that when he was at Harvard. And so he determined their relative abundances. He found that U-235 makes up only 0.7% of ordinary uranium, but U-238 is about 99%. And he ran into Enrico Fermi at a conference, and major mass spectrometer and separate the uranium into 3 isotopes and just send small quantities of each isotope to New York City from Minneapolis, so that we can find out which one of these is really responsible for fission. Uranium, they know fission, but there was probably one isotope that fissioned more than the others. So he did that, and he actually just pasted the little uranium samples in the margin of a letter, and sent it by airmail, special delivery to New York City, and they got it at Columbia. This happened like on Friday, and on Saturday, they bombarded the little samples with neutrons from the cyclotron, and then they called him on Sunday morning in Minneapolis, and he was still sleeping. Sunday morning, woke him up and said, guess what, U-235 is the one that's most responsible for fission in uranium. So that provided direction for the Manhattan Project. They knew that they had to enrich uranium into U-235, but he's the one that made that important discovery. Now, his invention of the mass spectrometer was very important for Y12 and K25 and other Manhattan Project facilities. You know, how else would you find out how much your uranium has been enriched without a mass spectrometer? So he pioneered the development of uranium analysis mass spectrometers, and General Electric made them in large quantities, and a lot of them were shipped here. He visited K25, where his inventions were used as detectors of leaks of helium and air gases such as oxygen and nitrogen. And thousands of men and women got jobs just monitoring these detectors, looking for leaks, and then they marked them. And then somebody came by and repaired the leaks, because there had to be a leak-proof system. So they would put helium in there, and if there was no detection of helium coming out, that was a good thing. They had to use the helium detectors to ensure that humid air was not leaking into the pipes. As you know, we have humid air in Tennessee. And because the water in that air could react with uranium hexafluoride and clog up the nickel barrier pores, those tiny little pores, essential to enriching uranium U-235. The calutron was actually based on the mass spectrometry. Now, Al Neer actually tried to separate uranium isotopes electromagnetically with his mass spectrometer, but he had lousy lab equipment, his magnets weren't very good. And so E.O. Lars visited him in the Minnesota lab and realized that he had lousy equipment, but he knew that he had great equipment at UC Berkeley, where he had invented the cyclotron. And around that time, Lawrence had also been visiting Dunning in Columbia, and Dunning said, oh, I think the way to go is to use gaseous diffusion to enrich uranium. And Lawrence said, well, that's not my thing. I've got some big magnets on the Hill of Berkeley, and my cyclotron's not built yet. My God, I'm going to try this mass spectrograph thing of Neer's. And I actually found this quote in a book called Lawrence and Oppenheimer by Wolfgar Davis. Is the name. I have the paperback of that. Thought that was a great quote. In November of 1941, Lawrence invited Neer to his Berkeley lab to help develop a hybrid of the cyclotron and mass spectrometer, which Lawrence later called a calutron, or California University cyclotron. Notice mass spec is not exactly in that name. Calutron is the name. And of course, Y12 became the home for hundreds, I think it was 1,152 calutrons that used uranium tetrafluoride. Now, actually, they had sent him uranium hexafluoride to do separations, but when he was at Harvard, he found that it was much better to use uranium hexafluoride to do the separations, and that was the feed gas used at Y12. So Lawrence listened to him, said, yeah, we'll go with the uranium tetrafluoride. And you'll hear more about that in a second. So in his oral history at the University of Minnesota, Neer said, referring to Lawrence and his California colleagues, I helped them with the design of the 180-degree separator they installed in the cyclotron magnet. They had big pumps because of the cyclotron, as well as high voltage supplies for accelerating magnets. They continued the development after I left, and that led to the calutron. It was essentially a blown-up version of what I had feared. Now we're going to talk about Virginia Spivey Coleman, who was a long-time Oak Ridger, and how she helped her boss's career, her boss being Clarence Larson. She was one of the girls of the Atomic City, the book by Denise Carolyn that Nick just mentioned, and she was a chemist. She got her chemistry degree from the University of North Carolina. She just went for 2 years because women weren't allowed to go to UNC for all 4 years. So she had to go to a women's college for 2 years. Grades were good. She got into UNC, majored in chemistry. And of course, the men in her class all said, nobody will hire you as a chemist, you're a woman. But my book did hire her. Virginia Spivey was her name at the time, and she determined in 1944 whether different uranium samples were sufficiently fluorinated. Remember, they had that uranium tetrachloride. So it was sufficiently fluorinated to be vaporized for doing the electromagnetic separations. Her supervisor was Clarence Larson. He managed the Whitehall chemistry lab in which she worked. She was told just to analyze the sample for chloride. She was not told how the compound was to be used. She was told to refer to uranium as tubaloid, yellow cake, or green cake. Sounds like it's made in the kitchen, doesn't it? And so she said, she was interviewed, and it was printed in the ORHPA in one of Ray's columns. She said, Dr. Larson would come by in the afternoon and ask me the results of my analysis. Once I told him, 99.2%. You want me to write down my results? And she knew it was a great result. No, he replied, I'll call you tomorrow and you tell me this result. The next morning he called her and asked about her latest results. So she told him. He pretended to be surprised, she said. She heard him say over the phone to people at a meeting with him, woohoo, 99.2%. That was so much better than the results of the previous year. So his chemistry lab and his management looked really great, right? Well, Virginia later found out that Larson, during that phone call, was meeting with the bigwigs, his superiors who would eventually promote him as he had hoped. Did the bigwigs know she was doing the analysis of all these uranium samples? No, she said, I was just a chemist in Larson's lab. So Larson was promoted to manager of the Whitehall plant, and then he became director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And then he, for the end of his career, he was on the Atomic Energy Commission. At the time, the division, Ray was chairman, and they ran, from 1946 to 74, and then became ORHPA, the regulatory commission. Larson was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1973 for the development of processes for recovery and purification of uranium and leadership in nuclear plant design. Trying to be fair to everybody here. Now we're going to talk about, maybe you would call him a villain, not a hero, George Koval, unknown traitor in Oak Ridge in the U.S., but an unsung hero in Russia while he was alive. And the book Sleeper Agent, the atomic spy in America who got away by Anne Hagedorn, is the source of my information here, and gave a talk to the lunch. She was speaking to the lunch for literacy event, which is held on 22nd in the high school this year. So I read her book. Now, George Koval was born in 1913 in Sioux City, Iowa, which had a lot of Jews and 4 synagogues. His Russian Jewish parents immigrated to the U.S. in 1910, along with 100,000 Jews. A lot of them were getting away from Russia because under the Tsar back then, a lot of Jews were being arrested. So they immigrated to other countries. George and his family moved back to Russia in 1932. But in the interim, George graduated from Central High School in Sioux City at age 15, probably the youngest ever to graduate at that age. And he moved back to, and he was a great interscholastic debater. He was very smart. He dropped out of college in Iowa because of the Great Depression. His father had been a carpenter, but they had to struggle just to raise enough money to support the family. And at that time, he felt like capitalism was a big failure. All these people were poor, losing jobs, committing suicide. Communism looked good to them compared to capitalism. He was an Iowa delegate to Young Communist League, and he got arrested at a government office for demanding food and shelter for 2 homeless middle-aged women. And other people joined him in saying, yeah, you need to feed these women. And he was arrested for inciting a riot because all these people were, lying with people and confronting people in the government office. He played baseball quite well, and he actually got to see Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig play an exhibition game in Sioux City. And he loved poetry, especially battles for women. So why would a young American become a Soviet spy? Well, his parents, as I said, embraced socialism and communism. They were pounding anti-Semitism not only before they left, but after America, after they came to America. So they returned to Russia, as I said, because they had heard that Lenin had made anti-Semitism a crime. This was after the October Revolution of 1917. And he was welcoming Jewish participation in society. While in the Soviet Union, George married Mila Ivanova. He earned a missionary degree from Mendeleev Institute in Moscow in 1939. And he was offered an opportunity to become trained to be a spy because, he spoke American. He's perfect, right? Well, at the time, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin was in power, and the Great Purge was underway. He was trying to get rid of 18 million political opponents, including their children, sent them to the Gulag. And the Gogol's were worried about Mila and her mother because Mila's father had a high position in the Red Army founded by Stalin's enemy, Leon Trotsky, who Stalin had exiled to Mexico. So by agreeing to become a spy and get the training, George Gogol was a loyalist. He was loyal to Stalin, so the family would be okay. And that was the case. They got an apartment for Mila and her mother at the time that George left. But unfortunately for her, she was a chemist. So she was asked to work in this factory to make explosives from oil residuals. And it was a very toxic environment. She got respiratory disease that lasted all her life, and she couldn't have children because of that toxicity. In 1940, Gogol got to New York City. He met with the Soviet handler. He registered at the U.S. Army. I mean, he was a U.S. citizen, right? He got a deferral for a while, but then somehow it was complicated, so I won't go into that. But he did score high on the Army classification test in 1943, and they sent him to the City College in New York for electrical engineering training. And of course, he got really high scores. So then he was sent to Oak Ridge. Now, according to Hagedorn, no one in Oak Ridge had a reason to analyze his Army registration form because he had quite an impressive record in the U.S. Army since his 1943 induction. And what they asked him to be, with all his engineering training, is to be a health physicist. So I guess he learned that really fast. But that allowed him to drive all over Oak Ridge in an Army jeep, okay, as a spy. But no one knew he was a spy, and he had access to secret information in all the plants. And he impressed his managers by writing a paper on airborne radioactivity. He said it doesn't just come from uranium in the nuclear plants; it comes from the uranium in the ground. So that was a very important paper, and it was used. So in Oak Ridge, he was in Oak Ridge from August 1944 to June 1945. And then he moved on to Dayton and did some more nuclear weapons type work as a nuclear physicist, that is. He was offered a permanent job by Monsanto, the contractor, as a physicist, but he declined because he started thinking, I got to figure out a way to get back to Moscow. I think I might get caught if I hang around too long. So what was it like? Well, then Hagedorn writes, and you can see his wife there. He was popular and outgoing, but always intensely private about his personal life. I made him a perfect spy. And as she writes, in his security file, he'd go live, like he said, my parents are dead. Well, they were both alive in the Soviet Union. And he told other little lies, but as she points out, unless the lies and half-truths in his records had been discovered, and they weren't, he simply could not have been rejected. He was a star in a group that was needed in 1944 wartime America. So what did he report to his handler? There was actually a guy named Clyde who came down and met him. He apparently gave him some of the information. But he also took a week off in New York City. And he reported that Y-12 and K-25 were producing enriched uranium, and that X-10 staff were using the pilot graphite reactor to produce plutonium from irradiated uranium slugs, and also to make bismuth 210 by irradiating bismuth 209, which was sent to Dayton, where it decayed into polonium 210, which was used as bomb trigger to kickstart the neutron chain reaction that would end in the detonation of the bomb. So one of the big messages that apparently got the Soviet Union is it's easier to make enough fuel for an A-bomb using reactor proteins of plutonium than to produce uranium from neutrons and gaseous diffusion. And it's easier to make polonium using a reactor than the lead dioxide process. When he left Dayton for New York City, he had to think about the looting detection. So he joined clubs. He wanted to be like a regular American guy, and he joined various clubs, and he avoided any spies that he knew in the network. He stayed away from them. And so he managed to spy them. And he knew that there were, in Canada, there were defecting Soviet spy leaders who were outing Soviet spies. But somehow they didn't have his name, so he did fine for a long time, and he did manage to and also he knew, the New York Times and Time Magazine had articles about atomic spies and all that, and the FBI was trying to find people, and they found these 10 that were convicted. So he escapes to Russia in 1948, a year before the Soviet Union exploded its first A-bomb, which was August 29th. The Soviet Union had built a reactor 3 years before, so they were, getting plutonium. And like the U.S. Trinity in Nagasaki atom bomb exploded 4 years earlier, the Soviet bomb used plutonium with an early polonium initiator. Now, there were other American, British, and Canadian spies for the Soviet Union, like Julian Rosenberg and Oz Fuchs, and they channeled U.S. atomic bomb secrets to Russia for the sake of world peace. Because they thought there would not be world peace if the world has a lead. They thought that world peace would be maintained only if the world has at least 2 nuclear superpowers, because they would, resist launching attacks through, because it would be collective suicide, and they didn't want. They didn't want the mutual assured, mutual assured destruction was the doctrine. So George Koval was basically the unsung hero in Russia while alive. But he was honored by Putin after he died. He received Russia's highest civilian honor, the Hero of the Russian Federation Gold Medal, for his role in the making of the first Soviet atomic bomb. What Putin said was, as he presented the Austrian's award to the defense minister, said Koval was the only Soviet intelligence officer to penetrate the U.S. secret atomic facilities producing plutonium, enriched uranium, and polonium used to create the atomic bomb. He helped speed up considerably the time it took for the Soviet Union to develop an atomic bomb of its own, thus ensuring the preservation of strategic military parity with the U.S. Of course, the problem here is I don't forget when the N-word, so that statement's not totally correct. But Putin doesn't always get it right? He doesn't have to tell the truth. And Haggard politics of prejudice upon his return to the Soviet Union, his story went unnoticed in the history of both nations. This politics of prejudice, when he went back, Stalin was in power, anti-Semitism was back. He had that problem, and anti-Americanism, of course, was there because it's the Cold War. So there was no chance he could rise in the GRU, Military Intelligence Agency, but they were fine with him getting a job as a professor of mechanical technology at the Malaya Institute, and he did that for 35 years. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Eugene Guth was at the lab in 1967, 1968. For sure, I'm not sure how long he was there. But he was an advisor to ORHPA Director Alan Weinberg. And I think the second issue of review, he offered to write an article on Oppenheimer because he thought people should know about his influences on the bridge. He wrote, Oppenheimer's great wartime leadership as director of the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory is well known. It is perhaps lesser known that, at least on 2 occasions, he directly accelerated developments at Oak Ridge. And can you name them? Well, I'll tell you. Okay. First, let's review obvious life quickly. In 1904, he was born in New York City to a textile importer and his wife. He had suffered from tuberculosis as a boy. He was given books, paintings, a small chemical lab. He earned his physics degrees from Harvard College and Cambridge University. In 1928, he returned from Europe to be a research fellow at Harvard and Caltech. Next year, assistant professor at both Caltech and UC Berkeley, where he became a full professor at age 32. He married Catherine Harrison in 1940 and they had 2 children. In 41, as chief theorist at Berkeley, he became involved in atomic weapons work. And in 43, he became director of Los Alamos Lab near Summer Range in New Mexico, and General Krause appointed him scientific director of the Manhattan Project. So he had an impact on the Y-12 calutrons. You, of course, can see them here, the famous racetrack with all the calutrons, and the young woman, probably just graduated from high school, is running a calutron. They were then called cubicle workers, and we called them calutron girls. So Lawrence heard rumors that the U-235 production using the Y-12 calutrons would be abandoned because things weren't going that well, and in favor of reactor production of plutonium at Hanford. He wired Oppenheimer about his concern, and Oppenheimer reassured him that he still favored the originally proposed Y-12 expansion to meet the new fuel needs. So they had these alpha calutrons, which are big machines, and they decided to add the smaller ones, which are called beta calutrons. So Oppenheimer, Lawrence went immediately to Oak to accelerate that expansion. And Oppenheimer also traveled to wartime Oak Ridge several times, first in the fall of 1943. Probably stayed at the Alexander. At least once he visited his brother Frank, who worked at Y-12 from 43 to 44, something I didn't know before. And Frank founded and directed the Exploratorium in San Francisco, the Science Museum. The second impact that Oppenheimer had was on increasing production of enriched uranium in the K-25 area on the Clinch River. Okay, now somewhere in here, K-25, the Maoyu is way over there. Okay, and then we have here the world's largest steam powerhouse. And we also know that the Maoyu building was probably the world's largest building. But Oak Ridge was not on the map. Okay, now this is the thermal diffusion plant, and what was going on here is it was feared that the combined capabilities of Y-12 and K-25 would not produce enough enriched uranium. So Oppenheimer pushed for the previously proposed liquid thermal diffusion method, which was invented primarily by Phil Abelson with the Navy, and a year later became the esteemed editor of Science magazine. Krause originally liked that method the best. That's the one he wanted to go with, and then he thought it was way too expensive, so he started looking at the alternatives. But anyway, Oppenheimer pushed for it again, and so that led to the construction of the S-50 plant in Oak Ridge. The combination of the three, they enriched uranium like to 2% in S-50, in K-25 they got it to 20%, and then Y-12 they got it to whatever they got it to. And that finally produced enough uranium enriched in 235 to meet the Manhattan Project goals and make Oak Ridge famous or infamous for providing the fuel for the world's first atomic bomb. Otherwise, the first one might have been a plutonium bomb, but it was a uranium bomb. Now, you probably heard of General Kenneth Nichols. He lived at 103 Olney Lane in Oak Ridge with his wife Jackie for a few years. In August 1943, he was promoted to district engineer of the Manhattan Engineering District, which made him second in command to General Krause as the military commanders. He oversaw the construction and operation of the nuclear fuel production facilities in Oak Ridge and Denver. And on November 2nd, 1953, he became general manager of the ABC. He initiated the ABC Personnel Security Board hearing on the loyalty and trustworthiness of Oppenheimer, who at the time was a consultant to ABC. But he was known to have connections to communists, so that's why they investigated him. Also, ABC Chairman Louis Strauss didn't like him at all because Oppenheimer was against the hydrogen bomb that Teller, Edward Teller was pushing, and he was kind of slowing the development of it. It was being funded by ABC. So on June 2nd, 1954, Nichols recommended that OPI's security clearance not be reinstated. In 5 security findings, Nichols said OPI was, quote, a communist in every sense except that he did not carry a party card, and that he is not reliable or trustworthy. And Strauss and the ABC commissions agreed, and he was stripped of his security clearance on June 29, 1954. And of course, that was during the time of McCarthyism. Little known facts about Oppenheimer. I don't know if Nichols knew about this or not. While pursuing a doctorate in theoretical physics, he was suffering from depression. He didn't have a girlfriend. He had lots of male friends who had girlfriends. And his parents were visiting him because they knew he was depressed and they were concerned. And then he got upset because his tutor, future Nobel laureate Patrick Blackett, forced him to do what he hated, experimental physics. He loved theory. He didn't want to be in the lab anymore. He wanted to do theoretical physics. So he got mad one day and he poisoned an apple that he thought Blackett would be eating. Injected cyanide or something into it. But when Blackett came in, he spotted there's something wrong with this apple. Didn't eat it, and then figured out it might have been a threat to his life and reported it. According to American Prometheus, Kybert and Martin Sherman's biography of Oppenheimer, quote, after protracted negotiations, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation and have regular sessions with prominent Harley Street psychiatrists in London. Now, his father apparently had to try to intervene too and said, please don't expel him, please don't tell the police, and that sort of thing. And so he got off. He also at one point tried to choke a male friend who said he had just proposed to a girlfriend. But as Malcolm Gladwell points out in his book, The Outliers, not all geniuses get away with attempted murder, because he was writing about geniuses in one of his chapters, and he pointed out that Oppenheimer was somewhat privileged and got away with it. Now, the gross selection of OPI's scientific record of the Manhattan Project was brilliant, and I really like this quote from Yuval Noah Harari, the author of *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, the international bestseller. It was published in 2015. He said, "The Nobel Peace Prize to end all peace prizes should have been given to Robert Oppenheimer and his fellow architects of the atomic bomb. Nuclear weapons have turned war between superpowers into collective suicide and made it impossible to seek world domination by force of arms." So So in light of what's going on with Ukraine and Putin's threats, it's an interesting quote to ponder. So the last person I'm going to talk about is Stanley Thompson. You've heard of Unsung, but have you heard of his good friend Stanley Thompson?
Yeah.
Now, Frank still has, because, and I will mention his involvement with Stanley in a few seconds. Unsung board, most of you know, co-discovered plutonium at the Large Radiation Lab at Berkeley. He headed plutonium separation work in Chicago during the Manhattan Project. He won the 1951 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and he served as UC Berkeley Chancellor and AEC Chair. Stanley Thompson is sometimes confused with the noted golf architect. If you Google Stanley Thompson, the first thing you get is the noted golf architect. If you Google Stanley G. Thompson, you will go directly to the scientist, but the wiki on him is very short. And there's a reference to the one done in German, which is much longer than if done in German. So, I would say he's an unsung chemist who had 3 unsung impacts on Oak Ridge. And here's what they are. First, the bismuth phosphate process he invented to separate plutonium from the radiated uranium slugs was first tested in Chicago, and then at Oak Ridge on a larger scale, and then used at the Hanford reactors to produce fuel for the second A bomb. The process that Seaport developed was not used. Second, Thompson discovered californium-252, the trench uranium isotope produced at ORHPA's isotope reactor, Hanford, and used as a neutron source in cancer treatment. I'll mention the practical applications in a minute. And third, Thompson discovered berkelium, also made at Hanford, which enabled the Russian-U.S. discovery in 2010 of element 117, named Tennessee after our state. So we should think about Stanley Thompson. He had an impact. Now, Seaport and Thompson were best friends from the age of 13. They met each other in high school in the Washington District of LA. They were classmates in the chemistry class. The teacher encouraged them both to choose chemistry as a career. Sad.
Computers.
Just click on it. I had special powers. Stan had a higher grade in chemistry than Glenn, which was valedictorian. They both attended and graduated in 1934 from UCLA. And Seaport didn't have a car. I guess he didn't have the money. But Thompson drove him to all the classes that they both attended. In 1934, after he graduated, Thompson took a chemistry job with Stanford, California, but Seaport decided to pursue graduate work in chemistry at UC Berkeley, and in fact, they're here in PhD. They lived as roommates for a while. They always lived close together. They visited CB spots together, and they lived all together quite a bit and equal lives. Of course, Seaport is famous for discovering plutonium in 1941. Then he moved to the Met Lab and to lead separation of plutonium. He hired chemists that he knew from UCLA and Berkeley, and he especially wanted Stan Thompson to join him in the project because he's such a fine chemist. So they used the 60-inch cyclotron at Berkeley to make plutonium by bombarding uranium target with neutrons. The isolation took place in 40, and chemically identified in 41 by Seaport, Edward McMillan, Joseph Kennedy, and Norman Paul. Seaport, Amelia Segre, and Kennedy found that plutonium-239 bombarded with slow neutrons was capable of fission like uranium-235. That meant it was bomb material. So Seaport and Edward McMillan jointly won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1951, quote, for their discoveries in the chemistry of trans-uranium elements, unquote. But Stan Thompson and his co-workers and he was leading teams, discovered 5 and possibly even 7 transurating elements. Seaborg was on some of these teams, but he wasn't leading them all. Okay, now at the Met Lab, there were 4 methods for doing chemical separations of plutonium and uranium. Seaborg came up with the lanthanum fluoride process, and it was favored, I mean, the boss approved, but until it proved to be corrosive. So Seaborg asked Thomson to investigate phosphates, and Stan found out that this phosphate chemical precipitation process, big words, retained 98% of the extracted plutonium in the precipitate, and furthermore, it was non-corrosive. Now, DuPont had to make a decision here. They had to contract to build plutonium separation plants at Oak Ridge and Hanford. And they had to make a tough decision fast. I think they had 3 months, so they had to pick the right process. So Cooper and Greenwald of DuPont decided they selected the bismuth phosphate process in May 43 because they realized it was safer and more efficient. Seemed like a good decision. Seaborg and Thomson visited Extend monthly for a year, starting in September 1943, to follow the progress of the plant being built by the graphite reactor. And the first plutonium that came out of Oak Ridge was sent to Los Alamos, and Segre discovered there that it had impurities, U-234 impurities, and therefore the gun design for the first atomic bomb, the uranium bomb, would not work with the plutonium bomb, so they had to come up with an implosion design, which just needs compression. So that was important that we send that plutonium to Los Alamos, and that guided the design. Now, Stan Thomson spent 1944 and 1945 with his family, actually, ensuring that the plutonium separation process worked at the 3 Hanford reactors. So plutonium, of course, was then sent to Los Alamos to be used in the second A bomb. Stan died of cancer in 1976 at age 64, possibly because of his radiation exposures at Hanford and Berkeley, where he did transurating chemistry. By the time he died, Purex and redox had replaced his plutonium separation process. So he led research teams that discovered 5 transurating elements. He was quite a good chemist. He used the ion exchange absorption dilution method for doing separations. He worked with Alan Orso, who improved the radiation detectors, because part of the identification involved the signature of the radiation signatures that come off the different elements. And they built shielded glove boxes for handling radioactive chemicals. Now, a little humor here. Stan Thomson, they synthesized and identified berkelium in California, and Stan Thomson said that it was such a stinker to get a quick identification for berkelium that he thought the chemical symbol should be BM. But cooler heads prevailed, and it ended up being accepted as BK. Stanley Thomson and his team also discovered the next 3 transurating elements, einsteinium, fermium, and then palladium, and 2 of them came out of the debris of a thermonuclear test in the Pacific Ocean. Oh, he did get some honors. He received the American Chemical Society Award for new applications in chemistry and 2 Guggenheim fellowships. California. It was made in 1950 by Thomson, Chemistry, Corso, and Seaborg. They were on the team. By firing helium nuclide at curium-242. Californium-252 is a radioactive metal produced at Hyper in milligram amounts only by neutron bombardment of plutonium-239. It exhibits spontaneous fissions, a strong neutron emitter. It has several good uses. It's used as a portable metal detector for identifying gold and silver ores, to identify water and oil layers and oil wells, and to detect metal fatigue and stress in airplanes. And it's highly effective for local control and cure of cervical cancers at all stages. There you can see the setting off radiation from my favorite photos. Berkeleyan was discovered in 1949 by Thompson, Warsaw, and Seaboard in Berkeley, made by bombarding americium-241 with alpha particles in the cyclotron. Berkeleyan can be made in weighable amounts by neutron bombardment in mercury, 244 and hyper. The only use of it, though, is to synthesize a super heavy element like tungsten. Physicists at Dubna, Russia, have been making super heavy elements 114, 115, 118 by bombarding various targets with calcium ions, but they needed a Berkeleyan target to make element 117. So Vanderbilt University physicist Jill Hamilton kept calling up the lab, probably Jim Roberto, asking for Berkeleyan 249 from Hyper. And when he first asked, he learned it cost us $3.5 million. So he kept checking back, hoping to get a better deal. Well, it turned out ORHPA got a contract to make Californian for a commercial product. So that meant they would be making Berkeleyan at the same time to get the Californian, and then they could separate them. So he worked out a deal with Jim Roberto that was satisfactory. And then there was a 2-year campaign at ORHPA to make, separate, and purify 22 milligrams of Berkeleyan. So in Russia, Dubna, in 2016, 6 atoms of element 117 were produced at Dubna after 50 days of the bombardment. The collaborators, of course, are ORHPA, Vanderbilt, Livermore, and Russian students who research. And the goal of this research is to find more massive elements that may form an island of stability, which is a cluster of stable superheavy elements not yet achieved that may have novel properties and practical applications. Here is Frank Lucille's book, Kaleidoscope Facets. Did you bring some?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody wants to buy one? Frank is here.
Offers Frank.
Frank was a student of, well, Frank was a corporate fellow from ORHPA, physicist there many years, and at other institutions, they discerned and done great work there. But he was a student of Stanley Thompson for, it looks like 4 years, 1961 to 65. And one of the 15 graduate students that he had. And he also interacted with Glenn Seaboard, who at that time was the university chancellor. Now, in his book, Frank said that his advisor was, quote, Stan Thompson, who did nearly all the actual work that led to Seaboard's Nobel Prize. And he also said that he did talk to Seaboard, who convinced him to change his field from chemistry to physics. So what are some hints that Thompson is an unsung chemist? Well, there's Frank Lucille's statement. And it's very short wiki. There are few available photos. I was on the internet. I found a lot of photos of Glenn Seaboard, but hardly any. So here's one. Here's a photo. And you can see that Glenn Seaboard is the tallest of the 4. And next to him is Stan and collaborators, chemistry and Warsaw. Well, there also is this website, and you can get information, you can get arguments about why Thompson received much less credit than he deserved. It's an anonymous website. I don't know who put it together. I don't think Frank did, but
No.
okay. Well, he's not telling, but